Good evening and welcome to everyone to the ordinary meeting of Council for the 11th September 2018, which is now open. I'd like to advise members of the public gallery that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the internet. The recording will also be available on Council's website. Gallery attendees are advised that their presence may be recorded. I'd also like to request that members of the gallery switch off their mobile phones to silent mode during tonight's meeting. Thank you. On behalf of Moonee Valley Council, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We also extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that might be here with us today. Councillors, I've received one apology for tonight's meeting, and that's from Councillor Cusack, and we still currently have Councillor Serace on approved leave of absence. Councillors, can I please have a mover and a seconder that the minutes for the ordinary meeting of Council held on the 28th of August 2018 be confirmed? Councillor Nation, Councillor Lawrence. Would you like to speak to that? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Declarations of conflict of interest. Does any councillor have a conflict of interest in any item on tonight's agenda?
Yes, Mayor, I have a conflict in item 10.11, an indirect conflict of interest due to conflicting duty for reasons disclosed to the CEO prior to the meeting.
Thank you, Councillor Nation. Councillors, do we have any presentations this evening? No. Public questions. I now ask the CEO, Brian Lancaster, whether we have received any public questions.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We have questions from 3 community members tonight, so I'll start with Mr Trevor Brooks. If he's in the gallery, I'll ask him to come forward to the lectern and ask his 2 questions, one at a time, and after his first question, the Director of Planning and Development will answer that, and then, Trevor, please ask your second question after the Director's answered the first question.
Yeah, okay. Why include T366 on the register when documentation provided showed damage to adjoining property, as root-bound drainage pipes, continually blocked gutters which are grounds for exclusion? Also, there was no validation of its historical significance.
Thanks, Mr Brooks. In light of the submission received, we did a further inspection of T366 and we did not see any obvious structural damage on site by either the tree root system or the overhanging canopy, and the tree was deemed to be structurally sound and well maintained. There's a laneway between the identified tree and the property owned by submitter 3, and that didn't show any visible signs of cracks from the tree root system, and therefore the recommendation is to maintain Council's position and pursue the tree controls. In terms of establishing the historical significance of the tree, we don't have hard evidence other than to assert that we think that the tree is some 300 plus years old, and therefore it's likely that it has remained there from previous land use. It should be noted that submitter 3, who may be yourself, will be invited to an independent panel should any concerns remain unresolved, and structural issues and historical comments can be discussed further at that time.
Right, okay. The second question is, why does the report state there's no notable damage to surrounding infrastructure? Does damage to adjacent houses not count? Documentary proof had been submitted that showed it was causing damage.
So having carried out 2 inspections of the trees and its surround, we didn't identify any notable damage to the surrounding infrastructure that would warrant it being removed from the draft register. A lot of trees are within urban settings, and the proposed tree control includes exemptions from a permit to remove branches. In other words, one can remove branches that overhang into neighbouring properties, and it's considered the majority, if not all, of the branches that overhang the submitter's property could be removed under this exemption.
No. I assume if there are issues, then it gets taken up when it goes to the panel.
It can be discussed extensively at panel.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Brooks. The second lot of questions is from Mr Stephen Hall, so if Mr Hall's here, I'll ask him to come to the gallery and read his questions one at a time, and the Director will respond to each one of those in turn.
Hello, yes. My first question is, our consultant arborist in 2016 says the concrete and the tree, this is T229, can easily coexist. Our 6 square carport shed has no cracks in it after 10 years, which is immediately next to the tree. Why should the car park prevent nomination as first recommended by council arborist?
So thanks, Mr Hall, for your question. Although it's noted that there's plans for a new car park or carport at 60 Farnham Street, that was not the reason for recommending the tree not be included on the register. The submissions received during the exhibition of the amendment brought to light some damage surrounding infrastructure that warranted a second inspection of the site and surrounds. And at that time, the arborist noted the tree was in an unfortunate location and had outgrown its context. So there was visible damage to surrounding infrastructure, and most notable was the rear existing car park of 60 Farnham Street. So the consultant arborist recommended not to pursue tree controls in that instance due to species suitability next to the infrastructure and buildings.
Okay, my second question, as the tree predates the flats at 60 Farnham Street by some decades, being estimated to be 80 to 120 years old, is it not the responsibility of neighbours to work around trees, even if not protected by significant tree registration, rather than to seek to remove them?
If the tree is not protected under the significant tree register, the proposed works for the car park that may impact the root system of the tree would become a civil issue between owners of each property. So the tree disputes are then covered under common law, which is the law the courts have developed over time. So that would make the liability for damages to the neighbour's tree while performing maintenance works, that would create that exposure. Conversely, the private tree owners may be liable for damage a tree is causing to neighbours' properties if evidence is provided the tree is impacting on the use and enjoyment of the land. So more information is available on that topic at the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria website, and we appreciate this challenge between preserving trees and maintenance of property. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hall. The last question is from Ms Cheryl Tinney. So if Ms Tinney is here, we can come to the lectern and ask her question, please.
Thank you. My question relates to agenda item 10.10, Significant Tree Register, Summary of Submissions Post-Consultation. One of the recommended changes to the draft Significant Tree Register is acceptance of a nomination of trees within the Ascot Vale Public Housing Estate for potential inclusion in a future review of the register. That was submission number 42, which was myself. DHHS have published Dunlop Avenue consultation plans and images, which indicates a significant reduction in mature native trees across the site, and that's on Plan 8 of the trees, of their plans and images. Given that the future review of the tree register is not for many years, and the redevelopment will be completed before the next review, will Council advocate for the retention of these and other estate trees in their submission to DHHS on the Dunlop Avenue estate when the time comes?
Thanks. Thank you very much. So Council's obviously aware of those plans that have been released for community consultation, and I guess the short answer to your question is yes. So Council is a responsible authority, and we will be assessing any permit applications for development of the estate, and we'll always advocate for the retention of established canopy on the site where it's appropriate, and advocate to maintain as much of that canopy as we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. That's the last of the questions.
Thank you, Mr Lancaster. Petitions and joint letters. Councillors, I don't believe we have any petitions or joint letters on tonight's agenda, so I'll go straight to reports from special committees. And once again, there is no item on tonight's agenda from special reports, so I'll go straight to council reports, which is item 10.1. Council report 10.1 on tonight's agenda is on the 2017 annual financial report. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? It's the annual report. I need a seconder. Councillor Sharp. Thank you. Councillor Lawrence, would you like to speak to the report?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. the annual financial report 2017-2018. There's a few highlights that come clearly to mind. From the report, the surplus of just over 13 million is an excellent result for the council, and I can certainly say that that's probably, I don't know whether it's a record result, but it's certainly a significant one, if nothing else. However, there were some items that draw attention. The capital grants were 3.5 million down on budget, which to me obviously needs more attention in terms of where we're applying for grants. Cash on hand was at just over 68, nearly 68.5 mil, and that's a very healthy financial position for any council to be in. So I applaud that. Capital works expenditure of 35.1 million with a carry forward amount of 9.12 into next year is good on one hand but bad on the other, and that shows that certain projects have not been completed for whatever reasons, and there's always genuine reasons, I realise that, but just in terms of account keeping, it's not always a great result. However, overall I think Moonee Valley City Council has a sound and strong financial position currently, and I certainly praise our financial controllers and our CEO for a responsible fiscal policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sharp, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. Happy to endorse the annual financial report and concur with comments made by Councillor Lawrence.
Would any other councillor like to speak to the item? Councillor Lawrence, would you like to close?
No, that's all. No, I think.
Okay, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Councillors, report on 10.12 on tonight's agenda relates to the planning policy framework for Moonee Valley Planning Scheme. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Marshall.
Thanks, Mayor. I'd like to move a motion in the form of the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Nation. Councillor Marshall, would you like to speak to the item?
Look, I will, and I'd open by saying I wouldn't blame people for being very confused because what we've had at the moment, there is lots going on in this space, and we've obviously had the revised MSS which came to council a little while ago, and what this report has been necessitated by is significant reform to the Victorian planning system that has occurred relatively recently. And so VC 148 introduced a tiered system planning. We've got the state planning policy, regional planning policy, and then local policy. And ultimately what the reform is designed to do is to make planning a bit simpler, because certainly simpler, more consistent, and more easy to read too, because when you pull out planning schemes, they can be quite confusing for people. So I think that's the plan in the long run. As I mentioned, our municipal strategic statement came to council. It was reviewed and extensively rewritten to try and reflect all of the work that had been done by MV 2040 as the overarching guiding policy, if you like, of the Moonee Valley Council. And so what this is doing is essentially trying to translate that work into the new framework which has been set up, and to make sure that we don't duplicate state policy, and to make sure that they're not matters that are included in local policy which really shouldn't be. It's not really that clear, I think it's probably fair to say, at this stage how this will proceed, whether our previous C193, I think it was, will actually be amended itself, or whether this will go through on another amendment process. But again, whenever it gets out on exhibition, however that actually occurs, obviously people will have the ability to make submissions and to express areas of concern. So, as I said, I certainly understand why there might be some confusion, and I sat down with officers and went through and appreciated their time going through to get my head around it and how it all worked. But this is an important part in the step to reforming our own planning scheme.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nation. Would any other councillor like to speak to the item? As there is no dissent, I'll put that straight to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. 10.3 on tonight's agenda is is on the 2017-18 performance statement and governance management checklist. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Nation.
Move a motion in the form of the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Byrne. Councillor Nation, would you like to speak to the item?
Just briefly, this is a mandatory requirement for all councils to submit to the Victorian Auditor General's Office, VAGO. It outlines our performance over the past 4 years and gives a snapshot of how we're performing in different areas on a year-to-year basis. One of the requirements of this performance statement is if there is a variation of 10%, we have to make commentary on those variations, and you can see through Appendix A, the performance statement, where there is variation in items such as animal management, food safety. You can see the reasons why. It's an important reporting tool because it gives a great snapshot for residents to understand where council's performing, possibly where council's not performing, and while it is a few numbers and words, it is not a huge document, the performance statement, and it's a good way to keep us accountable as a council and to see where we're excelling and where we maybe need to put in a little bit more work.
Thank you. Councillor Byrne.
Councillor Nation was fairly comprehensive. Most of it's in the document, but just briefly under the governance and management checklist, there's a legislative requirement for the 10-year asset management plan, but we've got a shorter-term asset management plan, which was the main difference in there, but I think it's self-explanatory. Thanks.
Thank you. Would any other councillor like to speak to the item? Councillor Lawrence.
Only just to make mention of the fact that the performance statement does mention we have 10,680 businesses within our municipality, which is more than what a lot of people really realise, and so there's a lot of work gets done in this municipality for the benefit of its residents and for the city of Moonee Valley.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Any other councillor? As there is no dissent, I'll put that straight to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Council Report 10.4 on tonight's agenda is our Capital Works Program Update. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Lawrence.
I move the officer's report.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Nation. Thank you. Councillor Lawrence, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The Capital Works report and update pretty much relates to the adjustment on a year-by-year basis of capital works from 2017-18 and into 2018-19, and includes the variations from reports and delegations. I won't go through them all because it's quite extensive, but if the viewers would care to look up on the Moonee Valley website, I'm sure they can find all the details. However, it does suffice to say that there are swings and roundabouts from year to year, and the Capital Works program, and we need to incorporate each year's financials for the Capital Works to allow for the unfinished Capital Works, if that makes sense. So there's a change that occurs, and we're just taking that into note, and that's the reason for this report. Thank you.
Councillor. Councillor Nation. Would any other councillor like to speak to the item? Councillor Byrne.
Just quickly, I just wanted to make note that the cricket nets at AJ Davis Reserve have been put off for 12 months based around the fact that we've received State and Cricket Australia and Cricket Club funding for the cricket nets at Maribyrnong Park, which are more utilised by the clubs, whereas AJ Davis is just overflow, but they are coming.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor like to say a few words? As there is no dissent, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Council Report 10.5 on tonight's agenda relates to kindergarten in Moonee Ponds. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Marshall.
I've always got to make sure I've got this microphone on. Mayor, I'd like to move that consideration of this report be deferred to an upcoming ordinary council meeting.
I'll see if I can get a seconder for you. Councillor Gauci-Marucci. Councillor Marshall, would you like to speak to the deferral?
Look, I will, because people might wonder why this is being deferred. But this originated as a series of reports out of a notice of motion that I put forward now a couple of years ago. And that notice of motion originated out of concerns that I'd had and other councillors at the time had about the difficulties faced by Moonee Ponds and Ascot Vale residents due to the lack of kindergarten in Moonee Ponds. I suppose in a leap of faith at the time, we were told about a range of different things that were happening in terms of the new system which came into place, which I think has definitely been an improvement on the old system. But it is fair to say that I keep having the same conversations with residents who live in Moonee Ponds or Ascot Vale who just miss out on a kindergarten of choice. And we need to be thinking about this differently. We don't hesitate to spend very large amounts of money on capital works for sporting facilities, and that's fine, but we need to think about where our priorities sit and the importance of expenditure on things that give our children a wonderful early start, which is what kindergarten does. So I'd certainly like to consider that as a matter of any deferral. And I suppose for me, the last point in the executive summary, which says the current demand for sessional 4-year-old kindergarten continues to be met, I acknowledge that the officers are working with what they've got in terms of infrastructure, but the difficulty is that you have situations where people who live in Moonee Ponds and Ascot Vale are being told, well, you don't have a spot at, it might be Progress or Coronation Kinder, two of our very popular kinders, but here's a spot at Strathmore, or here's a spot at East Keilor. And just with any family who tries to manage the balances of children, work, whatever it might be, while I appreciate officers are just trying to get a solution, it is just not at all practical for our families. So I'd like to consider those matters as part of any deferral.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Gauci-Marici. Would any other councillor like to speak to the item? As there is no dissent, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Next report is 10.6 and it relates to joint council statement against changes to the State Resolution Support Services program for people seeking asylum. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Notion.
Mayor, I'll move a motion in the form of the officer's recommendation, noting Councillor Cusack and myself as the nominated individuals in dot point 2.
Okay, I'll see if I can get a second for Councillor Marshall. Councillor Nation, would you like to speak to the item?
I will, Mayor, and I'm quite pleased to move this motion, which aims to endorse the joint council statement against changes to the Status Resolution Support Service for people seeking asylum. This statement has evolved out of a mayoral roundtable called by the City of Dandenong, attended by yourself, following the Department of Home Affairs making changes to the Status Resolution Support Services program's eligibility provisions. So, in essence, these changes will significantly reduce individuals' access to the program from approximately 13,300 individuals who are currently seeking asylum to just 5,000 or so that reach the stricter vulnerability criteria. Why this is significant for Moonee Valley, at present we have approximately 150 people living or residing in our municipality that are seeking asylum. There's actually an increase of 100% since 2014. In 2014 we had approximately 70 individuals seeking asylum in Moonee Valley, and that increase is the second largest of any municipality statewide. The Refugee Council of Australia anticipates that these changes will leave many vulnerable cohorts such as pregnant women, children, families with young children and survivors of torture who don't meet the department's heightened vulnerability criteria without any form of income to pay rent, prescriptions or any daily food requirements. As such, I'd ask my fellow councillors to support this initiative, that we join other councils to advocate for the retention of the SRSS in full, and I'd commend the City of Dandenong for initiating this move to bring all councils together to rally against these changes.
Thank you, Councillor. Just one minor correction. I wasn't able to make the meeting in Dandenong. It was attended by our officers. Councillor Marshall.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, I'm happy to rise to speak in support of the motion, and I'm always mindful that when we have discussions about people seeking asylum, that it always seems to be forgotten that at international law, Australia has obligations in relation to people who are seeking asylum. And, we have, I think the numbers were about 142 people in Moonee Valley, primarily in Avondale Heights, who are living on bridging visas. And the changes that have occurred here, if you think about the level of vulnerability that the people who are seeking asylum already have, basically you are leaving them without the income to put a roof over their head, to feed their families, to pay for medication. And I think it's absolutely disgraceful. I'm very pleased to see that Moonee Valley is taking this action and agreeing to be part of the task force, and also the contributions that we're proposing up there. I think too, I particularly liked in the report, it sets out the partnership model that we're seeking to develop with some of our wonderful providers who are in Moonee Valley, who do such magnificent work too, and that's something that we really do value in Moonee Valley, working closely with our partners. And this will be an opportunity, although we shouldn't be having to do it. Sometimes, as councils, we are left to pick up the pieces, and we do it, and we do it well.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nation. Oh no, sorry. You've already spoken about the item. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? As there is no dissent, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. 10.7 on tonight's agenda is Moonee Valley City Council Highball Stadium Development. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Byrne.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to move the officer's recommendation.
Do I have Councillor Marshall? Councillor Byrne, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is a really exciting step forward in the highball space, which has come a long way over the past couple of years. So a couple of weeks ago, where you and Councillor Marshall and Councillor Lawrence were at the netball presentations, it was quite embarrassing when we got up there and said, hey guys, we've got this long-term vision, we're going to build a highball stadium, but not until 2025. It's great that we had it, we've got the idea, but obviously 2025 is not a great outcome for the local community. What this report is doing is saying, with a few conditions, we're ready to go to bring it forward, which is really exciting. It's probably what we need to move forward in the space for budgeting. So what this is saying is that we're bringing forward the highball stadium design and construction allocation to commence in 2019 to 2020. Instead of 2022 to 23. So I think it puts us in a really good position to advocate ahead of the state elections, and obviously it's seeking $5 million funding for the development of the highball stadium from other levels. So this is really good. We've got the Aberfeldy Jets that have 105 teams and over 1,000 players and nowhere to play. They've been severely left out for way too long, and hopefully we can make sure we've got somewhere for them to go before 2025.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marshall.
Look, thanks, Mayor. When I first read this, I was, why are we discussing a hypothetical? But I have had it confirmed by officers that we need to bring this forward in terms of the low interest loan criteria to be able to meet that. So we need to be able to demonstrate that we're bringing the project forward. So in light of that, it's not a hypothetical that I initially thought it was. So for me, I think this is really picking up steam and it's important. And I think, as Councillor Byrne has indicated, there is a significant unmet demand in our community, that it is really important that we try and get this infrastructure in place as soon as we can, and certainly if we can be successful in seeking this additional funding and the loan, that would be very, very beneficial and obviously enable us to bring this project on in a very heavy capital works project that we have. There's only still that thing, and I'm mindful about the debate we had at the last council meeting. I note the consultation which has been done to date, which is a letterbox drop on Quinn Grove talking about the master plan. I just have this gnawing ache that I hope that we can get that consultation ramping up very, very quickly with the surrounding community members, because councillors who have been on here longer than me will know that often we have that situation where people get something in their letterbox and they don't read it. And it's not until they're looking at a 3D model or they're told very clearly this is what's going to be proposed that we have people who might have concerns or are otherwise. So I really hope we can get that side of things moving along very quickly and move to that next phase of consultation really as a matter of urgency.
Thank you, councillor. Any other councillor like to say a few words? As there is no dissent, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Next item on tonight's agenda is Moonee Valley Paid Parking Plan. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Sharp.
Move the officer's recommendation, Mr Mayor, but could I please add something to point 5? If point 5 could please read, receives a further report detailing the implementation of paid parking, including community feedback 6 months post-installation.
Thank you, councillor. I'll see if I can get a seconder for you. Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Sharp, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Paid parking, it's obviously a very complex issue. This report seeks to trial paid parking in a small number of areas at core pressure points across our municipality. My recommendation included receiving community feedback at the 6 month point, which I believe will be very important. Our aim in all of this is to manage parking demands associated with the population growth in Moonee Valley. And considering this, I'm happy to support this trial and look forward to receiving the 6 month report. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor. Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, it is a delicate subject, this one, and one that brings to mind a few things. One is that our rate base is not what it used to be in terms of being raised over a period of time, where in previous councils we didn't have or this council didn't have the rate restriction that now exists with the state government ensuring that the rate base is restricted. So, having said that, we need to look at other avenues for income, particularly if we have large infrastructure spending in light of the East Keilor Leisure Centre, the Highball Stadium that was just mentioned, and other large projects that libraries and the like that this council wants to provide for our community over the next few years. So, having said that, I was cognizant of the fact that we are putting in a trial for this, and that I think is a good move. However, if I was to compare what we're asking in terms of the parking fee, the gold coin that is being used is fairly insignificant when compared to other councils, and I use two examples close by within our region. The city of Hobson's Bay, I happened to be down there a week before last and had to park for a meeting for the Western Tourism Authority and Western Melbourne Tourism Authority, and for 2 hours it cost me $12 using a local parking meter. So I make the point that a gold coin for an hour is fairly insignificant, and compared to some of the other councils. City of Banyule, I was over there as well, over in Heidelberg, and we're in the hospital precinct there, and it's even higher, $14 for 2 hours there. So the $2 that we're asking for our alley for 2 hour parking is fairly insignificant compared to other councils. The other aspect which I'm pleased about is that these parking spaces are not near shopping strips, and so that they won't impact our traders, and that to me is very important. You know, if we think of the traders and I deal with quite a few of them, and there's certain parts of the municipality are doing it very hard at the moment, and we only have to look at Puckle Street in Moonee Ponds, and again Rose Street in Essendon, which are both suffering from trading conditions. So I'm glad to see those parking measures aren't being impacted on our local trading strips. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Byrne.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just quickly, I think it's probably worthy to note that we already have paid parking meters. They don't necessarily work that well, and they're quite expensive. So I'm glad that we're going for a cheaper rate. I don't see it as a revenue raiser, being a gold coin. I see it more as, and as it's documented in the report, as a behavioural base. Treadwell is written up in here, as is Matthews Avenue, and it just will, the idea behind it is to prompt the turnover. So people who want to get out on their lunch break, hopefully will have a spot available. That's what people want. We want the turnover as an option. It's a 6 months trial for extra spots. We can see how they go. We might get the feedback that it's horrible. If we get 20 objections, we can always take particular ones out. We'll just have to see how it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Would any other like to say a few words? Councillor Nation.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I concur with Councillor Byrne that this trial or this implementation of paid parking is, in my view, more about changing behaviours and pushing the concept of sustainable transport, which is so heavily documented throughout MV 2040. It's theme number 3, and the implementation of paid parking in certain locations is to facilitate that movement, the turnover of vehicles, but also make people think about how they're moving around the municipality, to ensure that people aren't necessarily coming in and taking spots for the whole day, and then travelling into the city, particularly those who might not live around a certain area, because the pressures that get put on our residential streets, and particularly around Moonee Ponds and Ascot Vale, are quite significant. The new parking spaces that we created in Eddy Street and Penny Lane, I think are ones where there shouldn't be too much opposition, because we are creating new spaces and we're not changing existing spaces to paid spaces. It's probably those along Woodland Street and Moore Street, possibly Treadwell Road, that may be a little bit more controversial. As I said, I view this as not a revenue raiser. I'd like it to hopefully promote sustainable transport throughout a municipality, and I wait with bated breath to see how it is received, and if habits do change, or if they don't.
Thank you, Councillor. Would any other Councillor Marshall?
Thank you, Mayor. And look, it's been fascinating listening to the debate on this, because it's probably raised a few things that have given me cause to consider my decision in a different way. I think I absolutely concur with Councillors Byrne and Nation. This is not about revenue raising, and if it is, there is absolutely no way I would support it. It's all the things, plays into everything that people think about councils. So I think we need to be really mindful about that. The trial is designed to try and change behaviours, but I also take on Councillor Lawrence's point around the pricing and whether that will be effective or not. One of my big concerns about this is that there are a couple of places in Moonee Ponds that are earmarked, and Councillor Nation has rightly pointed out the new parts in Eddy Street and Penny Lane, which I think are important, and even if this trial wasn't to proceed, should be done anyway. The Moore Street section is the stuff that concerns me particularly, and it's a very long section. And I know that the people in Browning and Chaucer, they have very significant parking issues in the streets already, located partly because of the location close to the activity centre, but also obviously because of what happens at the Ascot food store. And I've just got concerns when there is so much happening in Moonee Ponds. My strong preference would be to focus our energies into getting the car parking actually done that we're proposing to do. And I just am worried that the energy and the time and the trialling and the resources that should be going into actually creating that car park for people to actually have these spots would be better served. We'd be better served directing our energy that way rather than into this trial, which, as I said, particularly for Moonee Ponds, The area is under significant parking stress already, we know that. I'm just concerned as to whether this will actually have the effect, or whether you'll have people just rock up there and say, well, I'm going to sit here all day, I'll pay $10 or whatever it is a day. And if the genuine desire is to try and change that behaviour, whether that is what will happen. So yeah, I'm concerned about this in the context of so many moving parts, probably not necessarily for all of the other areas, but particularly for Moonee Ponds. And it's my strong view that our energy as a council should be going into getting that car parking done as soon as possible.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Gauchi-Marucci, you're the only one left. Would you like to say a few words? No?
Mr Mayor, if I could just have some clarification, I should say.
Point of clarification, yep.
Point of clarification. Amelia Avenue is photographed in the back of the report, but is not mentioned in the front, so if we could just have some clarification.
We can make a minor adjustment there. So one of the...
Thank you, through you, Mr Mayor. Just in response to that, there is some contestation about the delineation of land ownership between VicTrack and Council, and on the basis that we haven't fully resolved that matter, we've wanted to defer putting in paid parking at this stage.
Just in case somebody was reading it and got confused.
Thank you, Natalie. I'll actually allow the speaker to close if you like.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There's no doubt, I guess, we're saying it's a very complex issue, can also be quite a contentious issue, but I'll just stand by my statement that it's all about managing parking, certainly not to do with the revenue raising. I think that is certainly clear. It's all about earmarking our pressure points, and we've looked at the whole municipality, so no certain area has been targeted. It's widespread, which is good, I think, and a trial in that way I think will give us, because it's so broad, will give us a really good result, but it will be important to have that community feedback too, which I'm looking forward to.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour?
In favour is Councillor Sharp, Councillor Sypek, Councillor Byrne, Councillor Gauchi-Marucci, Councillor Lawrence.
All those against?
Councillor Nation, Councillor Marshall.
Thank you. Next item is on the agenda is update to the response to notice of motion 2017-21 electric car charging infrastructure. Councillor Lawrence.
Move the officer's report.
I'll see if I can get a seconder for you. Councillor Nation. Councillor Lawrence, would you like to say a few words?
Just very briefly, Mr Mayor, this is a good environmental initiative, even though it's not being implemented just yet. It's early days for electric cars and electric vehicles. However, good early planning is essential, and I note that the RACV even has electric charger in their car park in the city. I guess new cars are being built by all car companies, electric ones particularly, and it's going to become more and more of the way of transportation, which is a great thing. There are cities in China that exclude combustible, of all places, combustible engine cars, only with electric vehicles permitted. I think it's good. We will continue to monitor this through our offices, and charging stations, I guess, will eventually be implemented within our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Nation.
Thanks, Mayor. I think the recommendation probably tells us what we know, that it is still early days, that there hasn't been enough modelling to work out exactly the demand for charging points, what the uptake will be like. The report details, I think it's 8 vehicles in every 1,000 or possibly 10,000. I don't know, there's a comma in the wrong spot in that table, so I don't know if it's 8 in every 1,000 or 10,000. Regardless, it's a small figure in regards to the number of electric vehicles sold per either 1,000 or 10,000 of regular vehicles. It also is importantly in the report discusses exactly who wears the cost for the charging point, and I think that's really important to note because a lot of the higher end electric cars that are sold obviously have the charging points at home and the battery stations. But in terms of actually providing this infrastructure throughout the municipality, it's not just the installation, but it's actually the cost of electricity, which we are all aware is quite significant. So it tells us probably what we already know. It's early days. There's no directive from the state government as yet as to where to go in the local government space in regards to rolling out charging points. As points 4 and 5 state, it's sort of just wait and see. And should the need arise, or should we get directive from the state government, then it's probably time for council to act then.
Thank you, councillor. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? As there is no dissent, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. The next item on tonight's agenda is Significant Tree Register Summary of Submissions Post-Consultation. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Marshall.
Yes, Mayor. Happy to move a motion in the form of the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. I'll see if I can find a seconder for you. Councillor Nation. Councillor Marshall, would you like to speak to the item?
Look, this is getting to the pointy end of what is a long process, as they always are when you have planning scheme amendments happening. So some time ago, council did what I referred to at the time, I think is a pretty good description, a significant tree equivalent of a gap study, and our lovely heritage gap study. And what it did is it went through and looked at, all right, well, let's look at all of the potentially significant trees in Moonee Valley, rather than have this piecemeal approach, which is both inefficient and doesn't necessarily lead to the best outcomes in terms of ultimately whether controls are approved or not. So that was done, and what we have now is a report being presented to us following the submission of the exhibition process which occurred. We received quite a number of submissions, which is always great, and most of those submissions were from people who are private landowners and might be concerned about trees which were identified on their particular property and concerned in a range of ways about the potential for there to be controls over the tree. You can see that the report indicates, following the consideration of the submissions, what officers are recommending is that 12 records be removed from the register as those trees aren't present. And I think one of the things that's always important to keep in mind with the significant trees is that you have to go through a planning permit process, if I can spit that out. And that planning permit process, if you want to trim it or you want to, whatever you want to do, if you wanted to remove the tree, then you would need to go through that process. So it acts as a trigger. So some of those trees were removed following planning permit processes, and some were removed without having gone through that process, and I understand enforcement action is being taken in relation to those. There's also the proposal to make some minor edits and also to remove 13 trees from the register in response to submissions which were received, and there are a range of reasons why people put in those submissions and why it's been agreed that they be removed from the register. And as we had the questioner earlier today talking about the acceptance of nomination of trees within the Ascot Vale Public Housing Estate for a potential review, future review, but obviously there are other processes which we'll have our input in relation to those. So, as we know, having been through this process numerous times, what happens is that it will head off to panel in relation to the submissions, and so people will really have that opportunity to present there, and then the independent panel will make their recommendations as they see fit, and then we'll consider it going on from there. But it's a long process, but it's a really important one, and I'll, as always, be very interested to read about the history of the trees. It's quite fascinating when you go through in detail and read about both the history and the descriptions of the trees. So it'll be fascinating to see what the panel says about them.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nation. Would any other councillor like to speak to the item? Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We've been through a significant tree register quite a few years back, and I guess there's no doubt trees are vital and we need them, but sometimes I worry about how feedback from residents in the community is handled, and whether like how much weight, I guess, is put to it. Obviously weighing up the importance of the tree, and that's obviously vital, but I've had years ago there was an issue with a tree that came up, and had to go out and have a look at it and meet the residents and all the rest of it, and at that time it wasn't put on the tree register because of issues with it, but it was a long process to get anyone to sort of listen, I guess, really. It took a while. So I understand that the unresolved submissions will be going to the planning panel, but I'm just concerned that maybe these unresolved submissions we could have, well, I'm not sure. I'm not entirely at ease with it, I guess. I'm just flagging that. Thank you.
Councillor, any other councillor to say a few words? I'll allow the speaker to close.
Thanks, Mayor. I acknowledge Councillor Sharp's point, and it's an issue that comes up in the context of heritage controls over properties too, because some people have the view, you know what, this is my property and I should be able to do with it what I want. But we obviously have those obligations as a responsible authority to be able to look at the importance of issues like heritage and trees for that greater good, and it can be a real challenge to get that balance right. I think it's really important, taking Councillor Sharp's point again, that at the hearing process, and anyone who's attended them knows that you absolutely have the ability to stand there and argue your case, and often people bring experts along to do that for them. But the independent panel will really consider those submissions in detail. So it acts as a bit of a check and balance, if you like, if something has been missed and there's something that probably shouldn't be included. And it's a long process, but it has a number of points along the way at which there can be changes made. So what usually happens is it will come back to us, and obviously we'll see what the recommendations of the panel are.
Thank you, councillor. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillors? Oh, sorry, that's right, the closer. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour?
Councillor Nation, Councillor Marshall, Councillor Sypek, Councillor Byrne, Councillor Gauchi-Murici, Councillor Lawrence.
All those against?
Councillor Sharp.
Thank you. Next item on tonight's agenda is Windy Hill and Essendon Football Club. Councillors, do I have a motion?
Sorry, Mayor, as I have declared an indirect conflict of interest, I will depart the chamber.
Thank you, councillors. Councillor Gauchi-Murici.
I'd like to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Gauchi-Murici.
The report's fairly self-explanatory. Before they come wandering out with the sign. I know. Sorry, the report's fairly self-explanatory, but I think for me, when I first started on council, this was something that I asked lots of questions about. I've lived in Essendon for the vast majority of my life, and Windy Hill's always been a really well-loved precinct for locals and the broader community. I know whether it's exercising down there or watching training as a kid down there to now attending meetings for Rotary clubs or speaking at other different clubs there as well. For me, Windy Hill is the heart of the Essendon community, and it is really critically important for us to therefore have what our vision is for Windy Hill, both 10 years from now when the Essendon Football Club lease ends and for the decades that go beyond that. So I'm really pleased to see us progressing that vision through really broad consultation that's outlined in the report, just to make sure we understand the wants and needs of our community and we plan for that.
Thank you, councillor. Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Windy Hill and the Essendon Football Club, as Councillor Gauchi-Murici mentioned, are much loved ground and open space for Essendon and Strathmore and Moonee Ponds. and even a bit further away, Ascot Vale and Flemington. However, the history of Windy Hill is well known throughout our municipality, but it's also well known throughout Melbourne and to a degree throughout Australia. And we mustn't forget that very fact. And its significance lies in its history. And I'd hate to see that forgotten. Changes and improvements are needed though, and we bring this much-loved icon into its modern context. It needs maintenance, it needs significant capital works to bring it up to the community standards and its expectations. We need to consult, as Councillor Gauthier-Marucci alluded to, with our local Essendon community stakeholders, including the sporting clubs, the schools, the swimming clubs and those that use the swimming pool, social clubs, casual ground users such as myself who walks there quite regularly, exercisers and those that just enjoy the fact that it's open space for recreation. So all of those factors put it together as an area that gets used more than just for football matches, as is often alluded to, and we can do a lot to improve it, and that's what this is all about, and it's good to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other Councillor Sharp?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Windy Hill. It's certainly been on Council's agenda for a number of years now to get it sorted up there, and tonight we have before us a plan which I must thank the officers and Ms Reiter, who's sitting next to me, for taking on board my comments regarding how we need to communicate our plans to the wider community, because basically people looking at this plan, it's flagged to demolish Windy Hill and build a whole new stadium, community, maybe call it a community centre, if you want to call it that, rather than a stadium. It won't be a stadium. And look, I've grown up in Moonee Valley my entire life, and I do know the importance that Windy Hill has for the Moonee Valley community, particularly Essendon people, but my concern has been all along that the wider community weren't going to have an input into this. So, like I said, I thank the officers for including that in the recommendation, because it's really important. Because I don't really follow footy myself, but you know, if the community tell me that they don't really worry, or they're not going to worry about what happens to Windy Hill because Essendon Footy Club has moved out and all the rest of it, then I'll accept that. But I really want to know exactly what the community feel and want to see at this site, because it's a huge site and lots can be done, and you know, it can be made fantastic, but it has a history, and it has a long and proud history, and we need to be very careful about how all that's managed. So I look forward to seeing the results of all the communication. I look forward to all the communication going out, and I really hope that we get great feedback, because that will allow us to make the best decision. Because, you know, pretty much I think one of our issues has been we haven't been able to make the decision on this because we don't know what people are thinking either. So it's very hard for us to, in the past number of years, have been able to make an executive decision on this, because we haven't had a clear direction, because we haven't gone out and asked anybody other than the direct stakeholders. And obviously the stakeholders are a whole different kettle of fish from the wider community. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Marshall.
I view this as a much-needed circuit breaker, because we have been having the same discussions, or variants of the same discussions, for a number of years now. And Councillor Sharp has rightly pointed out the thing that has been missing in all of those discussions is, what does the broader community think about Windy Hill? You know, obviously there is certainly that emotional attachment for many, and that history that goes along with it. There's an acknowledgement by some about the fact that Essendon are no longer there and have created their base at Tullamarine. There are a range of stakeholders on site who have different viewpoints and different desires and different goals. But as to the way the broader Moonee Valley community views how this site should be used, whether it should be open with walking tracks, I've said, you could think about the possibilities here are endless, but we don't know because we haven't gone out to the community, and it is absolutely essential that this occurs. I acknowledge the work that Councillor Sharp has done in getting it to this point, so we stop having the same conversations over and over again, and they're difficult conversations to have, but it's also hindered us in our ability to go out there and advocate, because we can't go out there and say, well, give us some money because here's our plan for Windy Hill, because the reality is, and not being critical, but the existing master plan is deficient and it doesn't present a vision for the site. So I really look forward to seeing what the broader community think that this site should be looked at, should look like, how it should be used, and having those discussions obviously with the stakeholders, which is incredibly important. But I think for me this is a really exciting point, and there's just, the possibilities are really endless.
Thank you. Any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Gauchi-Marucci, would you like to close? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Megan, thank you. Just waiting for Councillor Nation to return to the chamber. Thank you, Councillor. The next item on tonight's agenda is Community Space Infrastructure Funds update on Overland Reserve. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Marshall.
Thanks, Mayor. I would like to move that Council 1 proceed with option 4, includes 220 square metres multi-purpose space plus 50 square metres of open deck at a cost of $3.9 million from 30th of October 2018, which would require an additional $280,000 budget, which amount includes an SRV grant of $250,000. And then a dot point if East Keilor Football Club and East Keilor Cricket Club agree to the proposed design. And then another dot point if East Keilor Football Club and East Keilor Cricket Club relinquish the lease on the current pavilion and move to seasonal allocation. And then 2, should the East Keilor Football Club and East Keilor Cricket Club not, first dot point, agree to the proposed design, and second dot point, relinquish their lease on the current pavilion and move to a seasonal allocation before December 30, 2018, the project should be abandoned.
Councillor, was that option 4 or 5?
Option 4. Sorry, it's proposed motion.
Proposed motion 5.
Option 4.
Okay, proposed
Just
motion 5.
confirming, yep.
Option 4.
Yeah, I did.
So we have the right one? Okay. I'll see if...
So yes, sorry, there's given to the, would you like me to read out that wording again?
Yeah, that'd be
for
great.
clarification. So it says at a cost of, so delete the word sum before 3.9 million. Yep, thank you. Which would require an additional, and then, so in the next line, sum, if you delete that too. So in point 1, yep, thank you. So it should read, require an additional $280,000 budget, and then the words which amount, so this is after the word, yep, budget, which amount includes an SRV grant of $250,000.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll see if I can find a seconder for you. Councillor Sharp. Councillor Marshall, would you like to speak to the item?
Look, this is a matter that's now been considered a number of times. Obviously, the pavilion, the existing pavilion needs an upgrade, as many of our pavilions do. So there has been some discussion with the current users about the proposed design and some concerns that they were going to actually be having less space than under the new design than what they currently had, and concerns about that in light of the fact that you've got 2 ovals and a very significant number of clubs. So this is acknowledging that there's been a redesign process which really preserves, if you like, their space and addresses that concern, and has an element of future proofing, which I wish Councillor Cusack was here to lecture me about, as he often does. For me, what's been important in this process is that the football club has actually got off their backside and offered to put money in themselves, which we don't often see from sporting clubs, so I do commend the club on that, and have been very proactive in working with council to try and source external money. And I think, yep, an AFL grant, and I think that was about $100,000. So I think that needs to be acknowledged, because a lot of clubs don't do that, and I hope that this can actually serve as a model for other clubs to say, you know what, let's really be partners in this and not just sit out and have council give us money. Let's proactively go out there, make contributions themselves, and see how we can source additional grant money. So on that basis, I'm okay with supporting the revised design.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, yes, this has been considered on a number of occasions, so I think we've got to a good result here tonight with the redesign, which provides for the space at minimal cost. Really, I just concur with what Councillor Marshall has just said, so happy to support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Lawrence. Oh, sorry, Councillor Lawrence.
So, thanks, Mr Mayor. Only to say that should the SRV grant come into be actually given, council's contribution will only be an extra $30,000 on top of the obviously budgeted figure. So, fingers crossed that the SRV grant comes in, and we only have a small extra contribution to make.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Byrne.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Whilst I only saw these plans an hour or so ago, I'm not necessarily against the plans and against the space being used, but I do like consistency, noting that this will now be one of the biggest pavilions in terms of social space. Cross Keys has 2 soccer pitches, more teams, more members, and a smaller space now. I'm concerned about the precedent that will be going down. But one of the concerns I have is in regards to if we get an SRV grant of $250,000, which was basically for energy, with the application that we put into them was for energy efficient reasons. If we get the grant, then we're going to be using that money effectively for increased social space. I just don't necessarily agree with how all of that works. I'm really excited that Overland Reserve is getting a new pavilion. It desperately needs to be done. I just don't necessarily agree with how we've gone about it. At the end of the day, it's ratepayers' money and it's $4 million on another sporting pavilion. But in saying that, I do understand that, and like one of the dot points that's in there, that it'll be opened up for the wider community use, which is fantastic. Thank you.
Councillor Gauci-Marucci.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. As Councillor Byrne mentioned, I similarly am not opposed to Overland Reserve being updated. I'm not opposed to the plans per se. Having only just seen them, I am not in a position to support the motion because I haven't had the time to digest the information. Certainly, I spoke at a women's leadership group for Moonee Valley a couple of weeks ago, and one of the key principles I said to that group was that decision making is about evidence and data and facts, and I haven't had time to interrogate that data to be in a position to support this. What I do know, and page 113 and 14 are what I was basing my initial decision on, is that our Social space for council is 130 square metres for sports with 15 players per team and 170 square metres for sports with over 15 players per team. And as is completely evident in that table, the average costs have increased dramatically over time, and the social spaces have also increased exponentially in that time. The proposal that we had in front of us at 184 square metres was bigger than all bar one of those pavilions. It's obviously now the biggest of all of them. And when you compare that to Fairburn, Cross Keys and Lebanon, which all have over 1,000 members and over 500 players, that's not the case here. So for me, I can't see how we go through future pavilion programs with a set guideline from council when it appears that we also say to clubs, just tell us what you want and we'll massage that into what is going to work for us. But then the flip side is I am appreciative that they've gotten grants, and I think that's really important. But then it's hard for me to correlate that when our report that we moved tonight showed that we were $3.5 million down on budgeted grants that we hadn't received. So for me, that extra $400,000 is a year of playground renewals, it's Queen's Park's refurbishment times 2, it's a LATAM implementation of 4 crossings, it's 4 years worth of street furniture. I can't spend money that I can visibly see elsewhere when I don't have the evidence in front of me to support why that 220 figure's been pulled out. So for me, I won't be supporting this motion, as important as I think it is to upgrade Overland Reserve.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nation.
Mayor, just a point of clarification, if I can ask through the chair to the relevant officer. Just confirming that the motion on the board and changing that original scope of the design isn't going to invalidate our SRV grant application?
Thank you, and through you, Mr Mayor, no, not at all. The SRV grant would go to the overall project rather than this particular addition.
That's all.
Thank you, Councillor. Would you like to say a few words?
No, that's fine.
Councillor Marshall, would you like to close, as there is dissent?
Thank you. I'm mindful about a few things, and the point that Councillor Nation just sought clarification on, he just got in before me, because that's what I assumed would happen, that this would in fact go to reduce the overall project cost rather than being allocated specifically to this space. So I'm pleased to hear that that is the case. I'm very mindful, talking about women in leadership, that a lot of this discussion, which has now been going on for some time, about Overland came about because of the desire to make the pavilion more female friendly.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really important that that point not be lost. For me, again, if you're looking at distinguishing factors between this, I actually can't think of another pavilion that we have done where a club has contributed its own money. Certainly not in recent history, and I can't remember a time when since I've been on council, and I could be wrong. So if you're thinking about why they might get a bit of extra space, they put their own hand in their pocket. Not only have they put their own hand in their pocket, but they have gone and actively worked with council and other organisations to bring money to this project. So if to date there's been, $150,000 essentially that has come about because of the club's work, if that had occurred at Cross Keys, maybe we would have had the same discussion. Correct. Instead, at Cross Keys, obviously, they got a $400,000 spend to get a bigger pitch. But anyway, won't go there. So I think in being mindful about that, we can't just say, well, you're going to put your hand in your pocket and you're just going to get the allocation that everybody else gets, who put nothing in at all. I mean, or else clubs will turn around and say, why would they bother? Why would they bother saying we will give additional money if they're not going to get something more for it? I mean, it's just the reality of how these things go, because if not, we need to really be encouraging clubs to try and to put in their own money. We've had this discussion about putting in-kind contributions. We need to push that forward. These need to be genuine partnerships because, again, if you're looking at limited resources, we need the clubs to be coming to the table. And in this instance, we have a club that has.
And this club has set a precedence because we've had another club that's approached us who wanted to put their hand in their pocket as well. So that'll come in the very near future. Councillors, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour?
Councillor Sharp, Councillor Nation, Councillor Marshall, Councillor Sypek, Councillor Lawrence,
All those against?
Councillor Boone, Councillor Gauchi-Marici.
Thank you, councillors. Notice of motion. Councillors, next item of business is notice of motion, and we have no notices of motion listed on tonight's agenda. Urgent business. Does any councillor have any urgent business tonight? Delegates report. Does any councillor have any delegates reports? Confidential reports. Councillors, the next item of business is a confidential report, and councillors, we have 2 confidential reports this evening. Councillors, can I have a motion that the meeting be closed to the public under section 89-2E of the Local Government Act 1989 to consider confidential reports? Councillor Nation. I'll see if I can get a seconder. Councillor Lawrence. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. This is where we say good night to the members of the public gallery and those watching the meeting on the internet. Thank you for your interest on tonight's meeting, and we will see you next time, and God bless.